Hello, I am François Combe from Université Gustave Eiffel in France. I'm going to present you this work that we realized with my colleague Martin Koenig, fellow researchers from IDRI in France, Yann Briand and Johannes Svensson, um, researchers from EDF Research and Development, the French historical and main producer of electricity, Gwenaël Lamy, Prabhat Puru Jean-Michel Kayla, and the researcher Julien Lefebvre from CIRED in France. This work is about scenarios of deep decarbonization of freight transport for France by 2050. The context, which I'm sure you're already quite aware of, is that we need a strategy of decarbonation for all sectors with the objective to reach carbon neutrality in 2050. The issue is that in most cases, multi-sectorial decarbonation pathways generally lack detail about each of the sectors. For example, in France, the National Decarbonization Strategy, SNDC, describes for many sectors which should be the objectives and the measures, but there is very little detail about how you actually reach those objectives. For example, for freight transport in this strategy, you have 2 pages of documentation. The second element of context, which is important, is that there is currently no consensus on a feasible and credible roadmap towards decarbonization of freight transport in 2050. This is an issue because road freight transport is one of the main emitters of greenhouse gases, and reductions are difficult. In France, we've got the specific context where rail freight transport accounts for only 10% of the total traffic, and this has been steadily decreasing for the past 50 years, despite many attempts to try to change these trends. And there is also the fact that in- and waterway transport is very limited in France, and this has been the case for a long time. The objective of this work is to explore freight decarbonization and the underlying issues. The fact is that freight transport is a complicated topic. Questions regarding its future in the long term pertain to the structure of the demand, the adequacy of the technical solutions, including transport modes, the characteristics of vehicles, and the way energy is provided to those vehicles, and actually also the way this energy is produced. We don't want here to present a unique prescriptive roadmap. The objective is to present to reveal the underlying questions, the interdependencies, and the perimeter of the issue. The method is to first identify the main drivers of GHG emissions. We have a common classic approach here, which is to derive CO2 emissions from the combination of a series of drivers which work sequentially in a way. The first one being the economic activity, here measured in terms of tons, multiplied by the structure of the freight flows, which include both the distances covered by the commodities and the capacity of the vehicles and their loading factors, and then the energy intensity of the vehicles and the carbon content of this energy. In this deep decarbonization pathway approach, which was elaborated by IDRI, the objective is to provide storylines and dashboards. So what are the underlying principles? We do not want to provide a unique and prescriptive roadmap, as I just explained. The objective here, on the contrary, is to provide possible scenarios and to present them in a very transparent and pedagogical way without any unexplored or implicit part in the way these scenarios have been designed. It appears to us the best way to do that is to combine the qualitative and quantitative approach of having, on one hand, scenarios based on storylines that we write based on a literature review and our knowledge of the past and future trends and the possibilities for the future of freight transport and the economy. And on the other hand, indicators grouped in a dashboard quantitative indicators, which will not be the result of a complicated model, but will be used as a consistency check of the storyline. The methodology is to take the storyline, transform its elements into quantitative variations of the indicators, and for one scenario to check that the combination of all these indicators and impacts of the elements of the storyline will have the intended effect to reach carbon neutrality at the end of the period we're interested in. So in a way, there's a backcasting philosophy to our work. A word about why we do not use a fully quantitative approach with a big model simulating everything. Well, the first reason is that simulations with these kind of models can be very complicated to analyze, and what we want here is that we have something which can be used as a support for discussion, something that can be easily understood and doesn't rely on the expertise of the reader or the stakeholders to analyze the outcomes of a complicated simulation algorithm. Maybe a second reason not to use a model here is that there are assumptions in models. Some of these assumptions are quite easy to identify because they are explicit calibration choices of the modelers. Other of these assumptions are much more complicated. They are the very often implicit assumptions which are associated to the choice of architecture and approach of the model, the mathematical specifications. And well, this sort of makes it very difficult to discuss those implicit assumptions, because to identify them and the implications that they have, this requires a very deep technical expertise, which is not often available. So as I started to explain earlier, the design of the scenarios was based on the combination of this qualitative and quantitative analysis. The qualitative analysis, it was a lot of work, quite methodical. The idea was to identify in the literature, the academic and the non-academic literature, based on our expert knowledge of the field of freight transport, forecasting what are the trends and possible future evolutions, both in the continuity of past trends or disruptive trends, anything that could change freight transport, either as an instrument towards carbon neutrality, or just a trend, a possible evolution of the economy, of demand behaviors, of logistics that can influence strongly the future of freight transport. So these trends were identified, associated to commodity types, and also categorized whether they are already active, they're supposed to get active, they are very hypothetical, and so on. Regarding the quantitative analysis, freight commodity flows, were classified into 6 big groups, being agri-food, heavy industry, waste, construction products, low added value, and high added value manufactured products, so that each trend can be associated to one or more of these categories. It appeared to us it was the right balance between complexity and the possibility to handle the heterogeneity in the number of groups when translating the qualitative analysis into quantitative indicators. Flow data about freight was also segmented by national versus international status, whether the flows are internal to the country, imports or exports. It was also distinguished by distance ranges, short distance, average distance, long distance, and also by type of road vehicles for road transport. So as I explained earlier, qualitative trends are transformed into quantitative changes. For example, agri-food transformation is transformed into a decrease of the tons moved per inhabitant for this category in one scenario. Regional location is transformed into shorter distances for low added value manufactured products in one of those two scenarios. Um, Obviously, there is a ton of possibilities of combination of all these trends. We chose to group them into two very contrasted scenarios. The first one is a scenario where the demand structure doesn't change much, the past trends continue up to a point, and decarbonation relies almost completely on an improvement of the technical characteristics of road freight transport vehicles. On the contrary, in the second scenario, there are huge changes in the demand structure through substantial changes in the economic structure, in the behavior of consumers, and so on and so forth. So in the second scenario, decarbonation doesn't come from the same source as in the first scenario, and in fact, it combines contributions from all the stages of the formation of GHG emissions. It has to be noted that road vehicles are modeled through a total cost of operation approach. There are different types of vehicles in terms of size, but there are also different types of vehicles in terms of energy. We've got 5 types of vehicles, basically internal combustion engine, two variations of electric vehicles, and hydrogen vehicles. So the first scenario, with just a bit more detail, this first scenario assumes that the freight flows will continue to increase. So there is economic growth and it is associated with more goods movement as mostly in the past. Supply chains continue to move towards additional flexibility, agility, and this puts pressure on the transport systems and it makes it impossible to increase the share of heavy transport modes such as rail freight. Road freight transport doesn't decrease as a consequence. It remains the backbone of the French freight transport. Decarbonation, as a consequence, relies entirely on the decarbonation of road vehicles, and this is an issue because carbon-neutral HGVs for distance over 500 kilometers is very difficult and a major challenge. So, as a consequence of all our assumptions, in our scenario, agrofuels will be needed in very large amounts. In the second scenario, the storyline is summarized as follows. We've got very deep changes of the production and trade systems. We've got a widespread of the circular economy, which translates into much shorter distances for freight exchanges. And the time constraints are loosened, which has implications both in terms of mode shift towards non-road modes and better loading factors of vehicles. Economic activities are relocated, and rail freight transport is heavily supported by a range of policy instruments. Quantitatively, I will just show here a subset of all the indicators which are part of the dashboard that is one of the results with the storylines of the deep pathway decarbonation approach. These first set of indicators are related to the demand. You've got, for the first scenario, on this side of on the left side of the slide, the amount of goods transported by tons, which increases steadily until 2050. The distances do not increase as fast, but there is no reduction for any type of commodity, and neither in terms of amounts nor in terms of distance. This is very different in the second scenario. There is a substantial but not very strong decrease in the amounts of goods which are moved, but the distances decrease a lot. These distances decrease a lot because of relocation. Exchanges are now much more local, and the exchanges that were on long distances are now on shorter distances. Much further in the dashboard, we see the technological composition of the HGV stock. And in the two scenarios, things are very different. In the first one, to accommodate the increase of freight transport demand, the stock of vehicles increases substantially. And we have in 2050 a mix of technologies which correspond to, in a way, to the mix of distances, where we've got electric vehicles and also a large share of internal combustion engines, thus the need for agrofuels to reach decarbonation. In the second scenario, the stock decreases a lot and there is a possibility for an almost entirely electric stock. So, as a conclusion, conclusions first in terms of methodology. I have to insist on the complexity of freight transportation. There is a technical specificity of the sector which implies that many of the things that we know about passenger transportation, which is much more studied, cannot be transferred to freight transportation. As a matter of fact, for this exercise that we did, just the basic architecture is similar with passenger mobility. There is also a lack of adequate data. It's very difficult to document everything that we're saying about freight transportation quantitatively. And there is this transversal nature of freight transport where it requires to have an opinion about how the economy will change in the future in many sectors, and that's a demanding exercise. This decarbonization approach, very quickly, just to remind, those are not roadmaps. Those are just a way to raise issues that have to be discussed by stakeholders that want to agree on a detailed roadmap. We show two philosophies which are contrasted, a very technological one and a more demand-based one, but the roadmap for a country will very probably find another combination of trends and actions. Okay, I will stop my presentation here and welcome your questions. Thank you for your attention.